welcome. And I'm going to be honest with you, normally I'm not that excited to be up in front of 120 people at 9 a.m. giving a talk, but today I am. This is a pretty cool departure from how we normally handle these meetings. I'm pretty excited about the format that we have today, and hopefully that bears out. A lot of this idea of a back to basics workshop was Connie's idea, and so if it'll go great, we've got Connie to thank, and if it doesn't, she's spread first. So the paleontological preparator competencies are something that we developed a few years ago as a result of an SVP Preparators grant. And so at the outset, if you've never heard of this before, you might be wondering, what are we talking about? Why did we embark on this endeavor? Well, a couple of our organizations, places like the Society for Paleontology or the government agencies like the National Park Service, actually have mandates that state that fossil specimens should be prepared by or under the supervision of trained personnel. NPS gets a little bit more specific where they talk about how preparation is a specialized subdiscipline of paleontology, which should only be performed by professionals with suitable training. Which left us as a community with some questions about, well, what does suitable training mean? Who are these professionals? What is this group that we're talking about? What are our standards? And so going back to the beginning of paleontology, we have not had much in the way of training the way many other conservation groups do. So art conservators have been able to get advanced degrees in art conservation since the 1920s. We've never really had anything like that. Training in paleontology is usually on the job. There aren't that many references available for people who are starting in preparation. Usually it's word of mouth. It's being handed down by the people who are supervising them in their labs. It might be a volunteer coordinator. I know many of us who are presenting today started as volunteers. I spent 3 years as a volunteer before getting my first job. So we don't have these well-defined standards. We don't have a really good way to pass this information on to future generations. So in 2011, Amy Davidson and Matt Smith and I wrote a grant proposal for the SVP Preparators grant, looking to define standards for preparation and identify necessary skills and abilities required to competently prepare fossils. So we built this on prior initiatives that we'd undertaken, that generations of people had undertaken through the SVP Preparators Committee, some things that we got started with, and then projects that kind of stalled. And so we were looking at this as a way to bring together a lot of pre-existing efforts into a product that we could then share. And the main corpus of that work took place during the 6-day writing workshop that we hosted down in Austin. So we brought everybody but Amy down to Texas, and Amy participated remotely, while the rest of us just sat here at this conference table and kind of locked ourselves into a room for about 11 to 12, 13 hours a day and hashed out the competencies. And as part of putting together these competency definitions, we also devised a curriculum for how we would teach these things. And so we started by saying, okay, well, what are the standards? And looking at how we would communicate that information to each other, to students. So our mandate from the outset was to look at a professional vertebrate fossil preparator and identifying some of the specialized skills, knowledge, and training that that individual needs to prepare specimens for research and education. And we, by the nature of the sponsorship of the Society for Paleontology, we were focused on vertebrate fossil preparators, focused on professional preparators, because that's where most of us were at that time. But this is really something that's applicable to all collections care staff, to professionals, to researchers who have never done preparation before but are still handling specimens, to volunteers, avocational amateur preparators who are all part of this community. And also, it's not just vertebrate fossils, it's pretty much everything that we interact with coming through the lab. And so what we were really trying to do is identify what does professionalism mean within fossil preparation. So we started by drawing heavily on documents from other professions. So we looked at the American Institute for Conservation's defining the conservator essential competencies. And if you compare those two documents, you'll see that there are a lot of commonalities. We really rely pretty heavily on their work. So both they're defining the conservator essential competencies, but also the requisite competencies for conservation technicians and collections care specialists, which is notable in that the conservator competencies document is only about, I think only about 15 pages, where the conservation technician document is closer to 90. And so they spend a lot of time drilling down specific tasks for what they consider conservation technicians to be able to do, and there's a lot of overlap in the way we work in preparation labs between both what they would consider to be kind of a professional conservator versus a conservation technician. So we decided to look just holistically at what happens in any lab, not really focus on breaking out those specifics. So we ended up with these 14 essential competencies that you'll see in the abstract book, and I don't expect you to read them all right now, but we presented them together in what we consider to be an unranked format. The only thing that we focused on was critical thinking and health and safety, bookending if there were more important among equals, then those would be it. And what we really focus on throughout these competencies is that they all tie together, that they all work in an interconnected way. And as you're working as a preparator, as a collections assistant, collections manager, whatever it is that you're doing in collections, most of these considerations are something that we need to be bearing in mind while we're working. And we'll get back to those throughout the course of the day and also in a few minutes. So we developed a curriculum based on our shared experience teaching and training in laboratories, workshops that we hosted. Several of us were involved in the Smithsonian volunteer training course back in 2008 in Petrified Forest, and Cal State University developed a preparation internship where Cal State students actually came out and spent 8 or 10 weeks working in the park. And so we based a lot of those training principles on experience that we had previously. We came up with a sample 16-week course where we talked about a lot of the basic preparation methods. We're not trying to teach expert preparators in a short window of time. And in fact, what I'm usually encountering in the programs where I'm teaching is that most of the students we have, so I'll spend a lot of time teaching graduate students, I don't expect most of them to go on to be preparators, maybe even to prepare another specimen again. But they go out and they get a faculty position somewhere, they become a curator, they're looking to figure out how to spend a couple $100,000 in startup as a new professor. They might be hiring preparators and designing a lab to give them the skills that they need at that point to be able to reach out, to do the research, to find preparators that they can talk to, get advice, and understand the basics of what they need in the lab and where their expertise is limited and where they need to go elsewhere to get somebody else's help in those matters. So the outcome of that preparators grant was this competencies white paper, the 14 essential competencies, which have then been incorporated into job descriptions since. So we've had a couple of jobs that have been posted where the competencies were something that an employer can use to help select candidates and say, these are the skills that we're looking for when people are applying for a job. So early on, you get, if we're hiring a lab manager position, you get a lot of people who apply for jobs who have never worked in paleontology at all. They say, well, I used to manage a chemistry lab, I can manage a paleontology lab. It's the same thing. And so being able to incorporate that into a job description makes it really easy for a hiring official who probably doesn't know much about the specialized needs of a preparation lab to make some decisions early on. So we've organized some workshops around some of these principles, and then both I and Marilyn Fox teach classes at our respective universities in paleontological techniques. So we teach lab methods classes and kind of introductory museum studies classes to paleontology students. One of the other big things that's come out of this is we've used that framework that we created to develop the competencies to move forward with a laboratory manual. So we've got a pending contract with Cambridge University Press, and there's about, 14 or 15 authors. This is a project that's been spearheaded by Steve Jabo. And so some point in the next couple of years, we'll have a book that results out of a lot of this work. So going back to the the competencies and critical thinking, health and safety, we can look at these as standalone units to try to understand them, but we really have to understand that they all work together synergistically, if you'll allow the use of that word, in a way that ensures the ultimate data collection and data preservation for any of our interactions with the specimens. So we're focusing on those things like critical thinking and health and safety to underpin it all. So you can be a perfectly competent welder. This guy probably has a great understanding of his tools and materials. But at the same time, there are some things that we might not think are ideal about this kind of work setup. So these are all just key points that you want to keep in mind as you're setting up your workstation, as you're approaching the fossil, as you're going to take something off of a shelf. Every aspect of these interactions, it interplays with the various competencies. So I'm going to talk about critical thinking as part of our introduction here. And to really drill down to the basics of it, we're talking about a methodology for enhancing the scientific value of this specimen. So I'm going to give a bunch of examples of areas where some of them are specimens that I've prepared, where judgment was questionable through categories like materials choice or methods choice, the way the specimen was handled or stored, and some of the problems or solutions to them falling under the category of communication, whether it's between the researcher and the preparator, figuring out exactly what it is that you need to know about that specimen, the record keeping or the avenues for recording, the various interactions that we've had and how we've changed them. So one of the first specimens we're going to look at here is this sauropod scapula. It was something that I prepared in, I think, 1999 is when I started working on this. So you can see all of these tiny little cracks running through this entire scapula. There were hundreds of pieces that this thing was broken into. It was a very poorly mineralized specimen. It had been laying out in a floodplain for years before it was buried and fossilized. And so the bone was not sturdy to begin with. Then it had been very close to the surface prior to collection, so there was a lot of root damage to the bone. There were roots growing through the bones that had to be cut out. And so at the time, because there were so many pieces and because it was this jigsaw puzzle, we decided to use 5-minute epoxy to glue the thing back together, or to adhere the thing back together. And over just the course of about 5 or 10 years, those materials deteriorated pretty rapidly. The 5-minute epoxy became very brittle in some places, and in some places it became very flexible. And it allowed for some really complex breaking in this specimen through the course of handling in collections and research subsequently. So we ended up with this fossil that broke multiple times in many ways. Most of them were new breaks because we used an epoxy that was not sacrificial. When it failed, when the joint failed, it actually broke the bone and not the material. So we spent a lot of time in preparator hours and in money for new materials and new supplies, re-preparing this, and then we also lost scientific data. So there were a breakdown in several areas here where we could have, if we had been thinking about this critically from the outset, thinking about our materials choices, thinking about the long-term handling, what's the ultimate outcome of the specimen, we could have definitely improved on its life in the collection's post-preparation. Another specimen comes from a paper from Williams and Doyle in 2010, where they were describing a poultice solution that they had made to remove some adhesive from this dental battery. So you've got some hadrosaur teeth up here, and you can see that most of them are covered with a coating of adhesive, and then this is a cleaned up surface. So they wanted to do an SEM analysis of these teeth looking at microwear. But that's really difficult to do when you've completely coated the surface of the tooth. You can't image it under SEM and actually see the microwear. So they tried to figure out how to remove this material that wasn't identified. They didn't know what it was, and they tried this chemical concoction to soften the material and allow them to scrape it away from the surface. But if you look down here, you can see, so this is the microwear evidence that they're looking for in the tooth surface, and these are the tool marks from trying to peel that adhesive off. So here's a question where early on we should have asked, do these teeth need to be coated in the first place? Is there any reason to coat fossils? Often there's not. In many of our labs we do that as a matter of course, or something happens during the molding and casting process. And because we haven't thought through what the end uses of that specimen are going to be, say you need to do SEM analysis, you need to do some kind of geochemical analysis that's going to be interfered with by the application of the materials. So, to begin with, we weren't thinking about what was being applied to it, and then it was never written down or communicated to the people who were working on it later. So So that's a pretty substantial barrier to doing further research on that specimen. So we've already invested a lot of hours in this thing to get it out in the field, to get it in the lab, to get it prepared. And then at some point its utility somewhat stops for a lot of potential research. So again, we've got obscured damage, obscured data, fossil damage, and we spent time and money trying to undo this work that maybe shouldn't have been done in the first place. Another specimen is this little iguanid lizard from the Gobi Desert that I prepared a couple of years ago, and at the time, I had seen some specimens that Amy Davidson had prepared and done this gorgeous 3D preparation. I said, okay, I want to be able to do that. I want to see if I can do that here in this specimen. And I started working around all the limbs, and you can see how three-dimensionally they're preserved here. So I was preparing out under the humerus, under the radius and ulna, and you can see the hand down there under all of that. The entire time I was in communication with the researcher, who was in New York at the time. He was at the American Museum, and I was in Chicago. So I was sending him emails one day saying, okay, well, hey, here's what I've done on this knee. How does this look? Oh, that looks great. That's awesome. Okay, cool. Well, I'll keep going. Okay. And just prepared all over this entire specimen. Got to the point where I needed to ship it from the Field Museum to the American Museum. And we said, well, how are we going to pack this? This is so incredibly fragile. There's no way to get this physically there. So developed a technique where we were coating this with cyclodecane. It's a sublimating waxy solid that we then coated with carbo wax so that it wouldn't sublimate during transit. And when I saw the researcher next, I said, hey, what did you think of that specimen? Was there anything in there that I should have done differently? Was there more preparation that you needed to see? I said, oh, what are you talking about? The only part that's identifiable is the teeth. That's all. That's the only diagnostic part of the specimen. So I spent maybe 6 weeks worth of work on this thing that didn't need to happen. It created a very fragile and dangerous specimen that eventually has to get shipped back to Mongolia. So we've increased dramatically the potential risk to that specimen. And in large part, that was just because we weren't communicating. We thought we were communicating well, but we weren't communicating the relevant questions. So again, that's one of the things that we try to teach in our preparation classes to our graduate students, is that you need to learn how to respond to inquiries from a preparator. You need to make sure that you're on the same page when you're talking about needs. So the final, or second to last, this is our penultimate case study here, is looking at these tenontosaur limb bones that were thin section for bone histology. They were looking at the graduate student at the time who was working on growth rates in dinosaurs. And she started cutting through these bones with this one, when the saw blade, this is a diamond thin section saw blade, it costs about $300 or $400 per blade for the wafering blades. Cut through this bone and hit this somewhat unnatural looking circular shape here in the middle of the bone shaft, which is actually a metal rod. There was epoxy. Now this is a humerus that's not very big. So there was no reason that a metal rod should have been in there to begin with. But they also drilled a hole to make a cavity for that metal rod. And so you can see here some of the bone structure. So if you're looking at growth rings in this bone, the youngest bone material is going to be on the inside, and here it's been drilled through. So if you're trying to figure out something about growth histories or metabolism in these animals, you might have a really hard time because there's material that's missing as a direct result of that. Also, it damages the equipment. And then when you're trying to grind this on a thin section saw, or a thin section grinder, that metal ring and the epoxy will heat up differently, will expand at differential rates, and the metal ring comes popping out and scratches your platen on the grinding surface, so you've got to replace that. So there's a lot going on there. So another common course of preparation method is molding and casting. Almost every specimen, ideally specimens are molded and cast before their thin section. But here you can see silicone rubber that's migrated into the bone, and you can look at the way the bones can potentially be damaged when you're demolding it. So here's another specimen that was prepared in the 1980s. This is Postasuchus from West Texas. This is a Triassic reptile. And what we see down here on the lower half of this figure is the original as-published figure by Sankar Chatterjee in 1985. So they collected this specimen, and in Chatterjee's paper, he describes the materials and methods section. He says we use a pin vise, ice pick, brush, acetone, and clip film. So it was reconstructed and re-described in the mid-90s by Vertebrate, and they looked at it and they said, well, you know, he made some claims in '85 that we really can't verify because it seems like there's a lot of plaster and paint on this. We're not really sure where it is, but we don't have the time or permission to go and repair it. So a graduate student in 2011 did just that. He went through and he re-prepared, reconstructed, and re-described the thing then. And during the preparation process, he identified plaster, chicken wire, and paint on top of matrix under which there was clean bone surface. So, so this reconstruction is based on sculpture, but there's no way to tell from the figure from the publication what part of that is. And as you look through it, you can actually see that there are some fairly substantial differences between these two reconstructions, including what bones of the skull make up the margins of the various openings, how many holes there are in some places. You have two mandibular symphyses here, or fenestrate here, and one really big one there. This was all just chicken wire and mesh during the preparation process. So again, this is the kind of thing that you're going to see throughout the day. We're going to look at case studies and examples of how the competencies are related to the day-to-day preparation that we all do. So, like this relates directly to competency number 3, understanding fossils as biological materials, where we know that the animal is actually under chicken wire. That's an important thing for the preparator to keep in mind, that this is actual anatomy that's under the specimen. Understanding the fossils as geological materials. Well, where does the matrix stop and the bone begin? That's another one of the key points in that competency, is being able to understand the difference. What is important here for particular questions? And even maybe more so than the question that we're asking right now, what about future research? And then documentation and record keeping. They identified, they thought, in 1985 what they used, but when you prepare that away in the 2000s, it doesn't match up. So something isn't tracking here, and it's incumbent upon all of us who are interacting with the specimens on a daily basis to be cognizant of this as we're working with them. And again, aptitude for tools and techniques, that was probably not a preferred technique to coat bone with plaster and chicken wire. So going back to the critical thinking, one of the most important take-home points in all of this, I think, is don't take our word for it. The people who are presenting here today are the people who effectively, answered the phone when we called and started talking about, hey, who wants to get together and talk. That the ultimately professionalism and competencies in the hands of the individual who's approaching it. One of the hardest things to learn in preparation, one of the hardest things to teach, is when to stop, when to know your own personal limits, and to always be looking at what you're doing, and always asking why. When I first got to the University of Texas about 7 years ago, I was all of a sudden surrounded with all these grad students. I was used to working mostly by myself in my lab. I spent 3 years doing that at Petrified Forest, where there weren't very many people at all who came through the door in the course of the day. And 10 years before that, where the preparators ran the labs and we weren't really questioned. So I get all these grad students who come and they say, okay, do this. And I say, why? Because I said so. But I'm like, okay, well, right, but why? Like, because that's what you need to do. Well, why? And I was like, oh wait, that's why they're here. They're here to ask why, and it's my job to tell them why. At least I do it that way. And that might not be the right way to do it. They can. It's up to them to take my answer and then apply the rest of this process to it. Just like it is for all of us on a daily basis. It's continued research is a key part of what we do in our field. Part of what makes people professionals or preparing to a professional level. Whether you're a volunteer who's only got 2 years of experience working next to a professional who's got 20, your specimens will probably be used for the same kind of research. The person who's looking at it at the end isn't going to know the difference between a specimen of a volunteer preparer and a seasoned professional or a seasoned volunteer preparer. So again, it's incumbent upon all of us to always be trying to make sure that we're meeting those standards, and if we can, pushing those standards forward. So I'm going to close with that, more or less on time. And it's really important to thank the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology Hicks Preparators grant. who funded this writing workshop. They also funded a grant 2 years ago, I think, to support filming of preparation techniques and putting together instructional videos, and a lot of that equipment and expertise is being applied today. So we've got 2 SVP Preparators grants who helped get us here, and then our institutions all supported a lot with time, and then people who have helped out and answered questions and provided guidance. So thank all those folks too. And we've got a few minutes for questions.